Good morning, and welcome to today's webcast, Assessing and Improving Equity in Grant Management and Program Development. Before we begin, I'm going to play a brief housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thanks for joining. We're pleased to present our continuing professional education webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. Today's session offers 1 CPE credit. To receive credit, you must meet the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy requirements. You must attend at least 50 minutes of the session and respond to at least 75% of polling questions. To participate in the polls, please check the button next to your answer within the slide window and click Submit. We'll track your progress and alert you when you've earned CPE credit. You can then click the certificate icon in the CPE Progress widget and download your CPE certificate. Don't worry if you can't download your CPE certificate today. We'll email you a copy in 2 weeks. If attending this webcast in a group, you must complete our group CPE attendance sheet, available in our Slide Deck and Handouts widget to receive credit. Please have all group members sign it and send only 1 sheet per group. CPE credit can only be awarded to participants registered as themselves and isn't available for participants who view the on-demand version. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
And with that, I'll turn it over to our presenters to get us started.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Michael Miranda-Moore. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns. I am a grant compliance manager here at the firm in our consulting division. Prior to joining our consulting team, I worked as an external auditor for Moss, doing primarily audits for not-for-profit and government entities with a special focus in single audits, which are my absolute favorite. But now I get to work on our consulting side, supporting all of those nonprofits and state and local government agencies.
My name is Megan Otto, consulting senior manager here at Moss Adams, a focus on grant compliance and grant management. Specifically, we tend to focus on subrecipient monitoring, however, also involved in grant development, grant review, and then also post-award services. So before Moss Adams, I was working out in the field at a nonprofit overseeing national AmeriCorps grants, and have utilized that experience in my role at Moss, having that perspective of being out there in the community, deploying grants and getting involved that way. So really excited for this webinar. I also sit on the Pride BRG, which is our internal LGBTQ plus resource group. And I'm really excited to share out information with you all today.
All right, we have our first polling question of today. What is your role in your organization? Either A, board member, B, CEO, executive director, C, management, D, staff, or E, other. So in order to answer this polling question today, please select the answer and hit the submit button for it to be recorded for CPE credit. We'll give you about 15 to 20 seconds here to answer this polling question. Getting about 85, almost 90% here. So give you about 5 more seconds to answer this polling question. Just as a reminder, you must answer 3 of the 4 polling questions today on your screen to receive your CPE credit. All right, how about we check out the results?
All right, solid spread. Awesome. All right, throughout this presentation, in addition to the polling questions, which are required for CPE, we'll be using a tool called Menti in order to help facilitate some interactivity with you all during this presentation. So on the screen now, we have the instructions for how to join. We will provide the QR code and the link and code to join every time we're ready to jump into it. But if you would like, you're welcome to go there now and have it up and ready. You can open it in another browser or scan the QR code on your phone. And we'll be using this throughout the presentation just to kind of hear more from you and to help facilitate our discussion. And like I mentioned, don't worry, it will be back on the screen again. All right. So the goal objectives of our presentation today is to help all of you understand what an equity assessment is, understand the benefits of conducting an equity assessment, as well as how to effectively utilize those results to make some meaningful change going forward.
Here is the agenda for our presentation. First, we're going to start off with the importance of equity in grant-funded work. Then we're really going to dive into what is an equity assessment, when is an equity assessment needed, what are the phases of an equity assessment, and then start talking about the benefits and then applications. So what data do you need? What data do you maybe already have? And then some additional considerations as you would be looking to implement an equity assessment. And then we'll end our presentation with questions. There is a Q&A box on your screen. If you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat box, and we will answer those at the end of the presentation. And I do see a question just popped up around the Menti QR code that Michael posted. We'll be sharing that every time there is a non-CPE polling question through Menti. So that'll come back on the screen shortly.
Great, and we have our second polling question for CPE today. Do you understand the difference between equity and equality? Either A, yes, B, I think so, C, no, but I know they are different. D, what difference are they synonymous? So we'll give you about 15 to 20 seconds to answer this one as well. And if you just select the answer on your screen and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded for CPE today.
Megan, do you know the answer?
I hope so.
I hope so too. But we'll all find out shortly.
All right. How about we check out the results?
Okay. That's reassuring. Lots of yeses, lots of I think so's. That's great to see. So before we get into what equity assessments are, we need to define what equity is. So spoiler alert, the answer to the question was that there is a difference between equity and equality. Equality is giving everyone the same tool. So in the image above, or in the image on the screen, we have that illustrated as everyone having the same bike. Everyone's got the same tool, therefore that is, in essence, equality. Equity, however, means that people should be treated uniquely by public policy in order to compensate for different circumstances and their different needs. Equity means that we acknowledge that we don't all come from the same place. We're not all starting at the same level, so the same tools aren't going to work for all of us. Equity is level setting so that we all have the right tools to be at the right, to be at an equitable level. So in the bottom image demonstrating equity, you can see that there are the right size bike for every individual instead of everyone trying to struggle to use a tool that's not suitable for them. It's the key difference between equality and equity. Equity is what we strive for, especially in grant-funded work.
And I think this is really important to highlight. I think over the past 10 years, there's been more of an emphasis on equity. And then prior to that, there was a lot of focus on equality. If everyone is equal, then it's a positive thing. But as you can see from the illustration, equality doesn't necessarily mean that there is equity for all.
So now we'll define an equity assessment. So equity assessments, often called equity audits or climate assessments, involve collecting and analyzing information, usually through multiple data gathering processes, to determine the extent to which a school, college, program, or other entity is equitable to each member of the community. It's a pulse check to see, are our resources fairly distributed? Are we meeting the needs of everybody? Is it accessible to all? It's a tool that can be used to better understand where the need is and how you can make changes so that it's a more equitable program, college, school, county, city. All right, so this is bringing us to our first mentee interactive question. Go ahead and scan the code on the screen, or you can go to menti.com, menti.com, and the code is 64242026. So we want to hear from all of you. Where are resources most needed in your community? What places need community resources the most? And that's your tax dollars or government bonds. Where in your community do you see the most need?
And this can be more of a personal opinion. Doesn't necessarily have to recognize the mission of your organization, but we just want to hear from you. You all working in nonprofits, local government are the ones that are really out in the field, communicating directly with communities. And so you're probably the best person to ask in terms of need in your community. I know when we were doing this exercise internally, I mentioned, I think that road repairs are a big thing in my area, and accessibility, transportation. So maybe that, maybe additional like unhoused youth services, just a couple to throw out there. But we'd just like to see what the range is looking like and what this group sees as being the priorities in their community.
Yeah, this word cloud here helps us visualize what those needs are. If you're unfamiliar with word clouds, the larger the word, the more responses there have been that are the same as that. So it's looking like mental health, housing, schools, homelessness, renewable energy. There's so many different objectives and goals and needs that our communities have, and often they're in conflict with one another because there is a limitation to the resources that we have. What an equity assessment can help us do is help us figure out where's the most dire need, where's action needed now, what will have the most impact, what's actually feasible. And we'll explore that more as we continue. Thank you for sharing. Please continue to.
Our word cloud will kind of evolve as we're getting more responses in. I did see some trends there around housing. Saw one around parks and areas, youth services. Those appeared to be some trends across this group. All right.
All right, now we want to go over the importance of equity assessments in grant-funded work. So they're necessary for several reasons. Promoting fairness, inclusivity, social justice in the allocation and distribution of resources. Ensuring fair resource distribution is vital. Like I mentioned before, there's a limitation to those resources. Tax dollars are not infinite. Employees working in the field are not infinite. So fair resource distribution is extremely important. And those resources historically have not been distributed fairly and don't always reach populations that have historically been marginalized or underrepresented. So equity assessment is crucial for addressing those systemic inequalities and promoting social justice. Additionally, equity assessments can help with building trust. One of the key ingredients to a successful equity assessment is community engagement. How do you support your community if you're not listening to them? So conducting an equity assessment shows that your organization, your city, your county, that you care, you want to know, you want to make an improvement, you want to understand the need. So that's one of the key benefits in doing an equity assessment. Improving project outcomes. So often there are amazing goals and intents for grant-funded work and really impactful missions, but they don't always pan out that way. Sometimes things change. Resources shift, maybe employees leave, and it's harder to complete those goals. And that can impact how the project performs, which then impacts equity in your community. It impacts how those resources are distributed, how the impact is felt. So conducting an equity assessment can help improve those outcomes by helping you identify and then monitor your goals and progress in your programs. And then also we're seeing more and more that grants are requiring that equity assessments or some form of it is being conducted either in the planning phases of your program or in the evaluations post-program. Funders want to know, are you having the intended impact? And an equity assessment will help you in meeting that requirement.
And to tie this back to the mentee exercise on the previous slide, we really want to show how there are so many different opinions and perspectives on what are critical needs in your community. While it's great to get community input and to have it be a very participatory exercise, there are a lot of other elements to performing an equity assessment. So really useful data that we could get by surveying the community, and in this case, surveying you all, but a more comprehensive look at what the needs are in your community and how they can be addressed equitably. Okay. So now that we know a little bit about what is an equity assessment and what are the differences between equality and equity, we want to move on to a couple examples of equity assessments. This first one that we're going to highlight is an equity assessment that was performed by Starbucks in 2018. It was really the first of its kind. It was an equity assessment performed by, in the private sector. It was not required. However, there was an incident at a Philadelphia Starbucks, which raised some questions about implicit bias in retail. In this instance, there was a lot of media attention on the company of Starbucks. Two African-American men, they were arrested after refusing to leave the store when they hadn't made a purchase. The Starbucks CEO apologized and they implemented anti-bias training for employees. But in addition to that, they partnered with a consultant to assess Starbucks policies and initiatives. They developed an equity assessment report, which shows how Starbucks could move forward in the future. This is something that the company has remained committed to date. They continue to share updates on their initiatives related to equity. And I think there's a lot of transparency here, and it's a great example of how they took a situation that was very unfortunate, and they have used that to implement changes in their organization and thus in their community. And I do want to pass it over to Michael because I know he was working at Starbucks at the time, so he has some firsthand knowledge of what it was like to go through the anti-bias training. And because this was one of the first of its kind, it really set an example for a lot of other companies and organizations across the country.
Yeah, like Megan mentioned, I was working at Starbucks at the time when this incident occurred. And in creating this presentation, thinking back to that, when things like this happen, often the response is very reactionary. And it doesn't just impact the community, it doesn't just impact your business, but it impacts your employees as well. I know that when this occurred, I didn't feel very good about the company, how they handled it at first. I lost a lot of trust in the organization, somewhere that I thought was really progressive and very supportive of all members of the community. It seemed out of line with their values. So in hearing the steps that they were taking to make amends and improve, it did restore a little bit of trust. But I also appreciated that they were holding themselves accountable. So it impacts everybody. And performing equity assessments or similar types of assessments preventatively, just because you should, will help you prevent running into instances like this where real harm is done and you do have to rebuild trust with your community or with your employees.
An additional example of an equity assessment that we wanted to highlight was an equity assessment performed by the government agency AmeriCorps in 2022. This equity assessment was performed in response to the executive order, which does require all federal agencies to have equity assessments performed. So if you go to performance.gov, you can view equity assessments for every government agency. And there's some really interesting information on there about some of the challenges that agencies are facing and their plans to address them. In this case, progress for AmeriCorps will be tracked quarterly and annually, and there's a sense of accountability that they have built into their equity assessment and their implementation plan. A few of the things that were highlighted in their equity assessment were the need to increase program accessibility for members with disability, improving communication around benefits, and then conducting an outreach team which focused on building a more diverse portfolio of grantees and participants. So when thinking about their equity assessment, they also thought about the indicators that they can track. How can they make sure that they're making progress in their community to improve equity? But a lot of really great examples on performance.gov of the way federal agencies are addressing this. And I will say this one was also reactionary. It was in reaction to the executive order. So while there wasn't a particular instance that that triggered it, similar to or unsimilar to Starbucks, but it still was a reactionary response. So I'm hopeful that we can get to a place where equity assessments become more of the norm, and that organizations and agencies are performing them before it's a requirement, and because they want to, and because they want to know how their work out in the community can be most effective. I'm unable to go to the next slide, Michael. I don't know if you can.
Looks like it's up now.
Okay. Let me do a quick on the. All right. Looks like my window is frozen. So I'm going to hop off really quick and hop back on. Michael, if you'd like to take the next slide, and then I'll hop back in.
Absolutely. So in some cases, equity assessments can be really beneficial in identifying gaps in your programs. In this example, the National Science Foundation awarded $1.5 million grant to UC Berkeley to assist in a research project that was assessing the effects of climate change on coastal ecosystems. One of the main issues with the project is that it didn't provide enough accommodations for people with disabilities to participate in the data collection process. Part of this program engaged the community by asking them to go out and do their own research and collect information. And in coastal ecosystems, that was less accessible for people with mobility impairments or other disabilities. And Megan, it looks like you're back.
Yes, I am. And just to wrap this one up, this was an instance where UC Berkeley could have strongly benefited from performing an equity assessment or something similar to assess what potential mitigation measures or what additional accessibility tools would need to be put into place in order to make this program as accessible as possible. It looks like I'm able to navigate now. So thank you, Michael, for taking that one. Next, the two main types of equity assessments that we want to highlight are high-level enterprise-wide equity assessments that are looking to pinpoint future areas of focus. So those are really forward-thinking. Here's where we're at now, and what can we do to get to where we want to be? I think of this more as a gap assessment. And then a more targeted assessment, which would identify any inequities to an existing program, service, or function. Those tend to be more reactionary, like a couple of the examples that we covered earlier, but both can be incredibly valuable to an organization.
All right, we have another Mentimeter question for you all. What are some reasons you have or would conduct an equity assessment? So you can go to menti.com, MENTI, and enter the code 64242026, or scan the QR code on the screen, and then you'll be able to share with us your response. So what are some reasons that you have or would conduct an equity assessment? And a reminder that the mentee questions are simply just for us to engage with you all and have a more interactive presentation. They are not for CPE. We still have polling questions for you to get your CPE. All right, I'm seeing a lot of great responses. Grant requirements for research, need of community, lack of resources, ensure fairness, transparency. Accessibility is a big one that I think is often overlooked. In the case that we just discussed with the National Science Foundation, there's many things that we can actually do to make programs more accessible. In that instance, an equity assessment wasn't performed, but after the accessibility concerns were identified, they were able to use drones for people with mobility impairments to be able to collect data, which is a unique solution to be able to make that program more accessible to everybody. We've got lots of tools at our disposal to ensure that we can all participate and all be on the same playing field. So accessibility is a huge reason to do one. It's the right thing to do. Yes, I love that one. It is absolutely the right thing to do.
I do see a comment that just came through in the chat. Someone letting us know that for their organization, they wanted to make sure that they were meeting, that they were representing the languages of their community needs in their communications and their outreach efforts. So they would like to include hiring efforts as part of their initiatives to make sure that they're supporting the community in the best and most accessible way.
Yeah, that's a great point. We've assisted with a handful of programs that serve very diverse communities and regions that have very concentrated populations of a lot of different people that speak different languages, and not having resources in their first language made it really difficult for organizations to get community involvement, for people to participate in programs. And I know in some of our presentations, we try to ensure that we have translation services, and that includes ASL as well. And that's another, ties in with accessibility. If you can't understand the language, then it's not accessible to you. So definitely something to consider in your programs, and what an equity assessment can help with is help you identify what are the diverse needs of the population I'm trying to serve. Fantastic. Yeah, understanding where we need to change policies and procedures is super important. Accountability is huge. Analyzing program impacts. Yeah, equity assessments are essential for figuring out if programs actually did what they were supposed to, where communities helped in the way that they were needed, goals achieved. Awesome. All right, I think we can move on, but feel free to keep sending in responses.
All right, and then when is an equity assessment needed? I think we touched on this a little bit in the previous slide about the two main different types of equity assessments, but I think that it's really important to think about, outside of conceptualizing what an equity assessment is, really thinking about how you can use one in your organization and put it into practice. So one example of when an equity assessment may be needed is when your organization has an opportunity to make or influence decisions, policies, practices, programs that could affect equitable outcomes. An example of that I would provide would be if you all are applying for a new grant. If you want to take a look at what are the needs in the community and how can we form this grant application around what the needs are, so you can ensure that you're most effectively reaching the individuals in need. And then when prior organizational decisions, policies, programs, they failed to address community needs or were inequitable in their design and implementation, which does happen frequently. I don't believe anyone has the intent of creating programs that are inequitable. However, sometimes there just isn't enough information, or enough information wasn't gathered on the front end. So performing the equity assessment at the front end can be a great way to mitigate this, and really pivot as well. So this is something that you can also implement after looking at some of your performance outcomes and reviewing those and seeing if you're hitting some of those targets that you may have set related to equity, related to impact at the beginning of your award. All right. And then some other factors of when you may need to consider an equity assessment are community input on the need for equitable grant programs. You may be hearing from people directly in the community, and those are impacted, saying, like, you know, we really need resources around this. We really need to find solutions for housing in our area. And that can hopefully draw a lot of attention of community leaders, and they can act accordingly. And then a trend that we're seeing is recommended or prioritized in grant making. So private foundations typically do not explicitly require equity assessment, but more often than not now, it is an element of your application. It may not be referred to as an equity assessment that you would have to do on the front end, but more of how are you going to ensure that programming is equitable in your community. And that can kind of be a shot in the dark if you're not looking at data, if you aren't being forward thinking about what those needs are. And then when equity assessments are a requirement, we talked earlier about how federal agencies are required to conduct equity assessments internally. And we are seeing that become a trend on the federal side. For example, there is a HUD program, the Regional Fair Housing and Equity Program, which does require an equity assessment as part of the program implementation process. So I think it's something that we can all make sure that we have better awareness of, better knowledge. I would say getting ahead of the curve by implementing equity assessments or some form of equity assessment. We think that that term can be a little bit intimidating, especially for smaller organizations or those that may not have large amounts of budgets to spend on a full comprehensive equity assessment. But there are a lot of other data factors that you can look at to assess equity in the community.
Awesome. And now we'll go over the phases of an equity assessment. So as you may see, it's a cyclical process, but we've broken it up into three main phases. So that first phase there is developing an action plan, and then monitoring progress, and then evaluating those results. And ideally, you don't just do one equity assessment, you're doing them ongoing at a frequency that is right for the needs of your program or community organization. But as you conduct an equity assessment, you go through all these phases, you're revisiting them as well. So once you evaluate those results, you're going back and either developing a new action plan or tweaking your existing one. And we'll dive into these phases in more detail. All right, so phase one, developing a plan of action. So the goal of this phase primarily is to describe the program. So what are the program policies, populations that are going to be observed or impacted by the program. Consider the context then. What are the drivers of disparities in the community or in the program, and how that's being implemented? Collecting input. That includes input from experts. We're talking about assisting in providing more housing, talking about housing experts, or getting input from the affected community members, talking to those who are living in those disparities and hearing from them what would make things better for them, what improvements do they want to see. And then identifying gaps. What information do we not have? What do we not know? What resources do we not know or not have? Analyzing the effects, so the effects of the policy or program. And at this stage, that's looking at what are the potential effects? What's the current state? And then what are we looking to get to? How can we improve for people and communities? And then all of that coincides into the implementation of that plan of action. And included in that implementation needs to be a plan of action for accountability as well. Right. And then the next phase is monitoring that progress. There's a lot of ways to monitor your progress in your equity assessment. So it's important to establish a monitoring framework. And that'll look different across programs, across communities. Some of these might not be feasible or might have a different need. So some of those things to incorporate into your monitoring framework are community engagement. That's key. Getting community members involved, speaking to their experiences with systemic and institutional oppression, and then intentionally involving them in drafting policy, practice, making these decisions, monitoring your progress against key performance indicators. What factors are we looking at to show us that we are meeting the mark? Is it number of people off the street and in housing? Is it patient beds in rehab facilities? Like what key performance indicators are going to show us that we are meeting our goal? And then getting that feedback. You can use certain surveys or other feedback mechanisms, but getting that input on how things are going. And then benchmarking as well. You can look to other similar programs or communities with other similar needs and assess your organization or your program against theirs and see what are they doing, and are we in a similar space? Can we leverage some of what their experiences are to support us? Use them as a guide to see, are we meeting the mark? And then the last phase is evaluating those results. So ideally, an equity assessment is going to leave you with recommendations on how to improve. Part of the evaluation phase, though, is figuring out, are these recommendations even feasible? An equity assessment might identify a lot of great ways that you can make improvements in your program, policies, communities, but they might not be doable with your organization or with the program as it is. Time is a constraint, resources are a constraint. But also need to keep tabs on those unfeasible recommendations. How are you going to address them in the future? You have to make sure that they're not going to just fall off. Just because they can't be done now doesn't mean that they can't ever be done, and that those improvements can't be made and those recommendations are forever unfeasible. And the other key area in evaluating results is the impact. So do these recommendations address the root causes of disparities, or are they simply just Band-Aids for symptoms of them? Are we really addressing the core issue that is leading to the inequity that we're trying to address? Are they going to really lead to improved equity? So those are the key things to think of when evaluating results of your equity assessment, and will really help inform your next equity assessment and lead into developing that new action plan or revising the existing one. It's not a one and done process, and it won't be perfect every time. There will always be recommendations that aren't going to be as feasible, or there will be a limitation on resources, but with time and with the right intention, like those things can be remedied.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. We have our third polling question of the day for CPE. Which of the following are considerations that should be made when evaluating the results of an equity assessment? Either A, feasibility, B, impact, C, time and resources, or D, all of the above. I'll give you about 15 to 20 seconds to answer this polling question. If you just select your answer and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded for CPE today. We're about 85, 90% here, so we'll give you about 5 more seconds. All right, let's check out the results.
All of the above, absolutely. All of these things should be considered in evaluating the results of an equity assessment. Time and resources, impact, feasibility, all of that is super important. And now we have another Mentimeter activity. So again, go ahead and scan the code on the screen, or join at menti.com and use the code 64242026. We want to hear from you. What is the biggest barrier to equity at your organization? Right, seeing some great responses so far. Funding, resources, absolutely. Funding is still huge there, which is meaning that is the primary barrier, and that makes a lot of sense. Conducting an equity assessment can help build a case for increased funding or a shift in funding, help support you and your organization being able to advocate for programs that could benefit from equitable for people. Awesome. All right.
All right, so now that we've covered what an equity assessment is, the different phases of it, we want to talk about the benefits of an equity assessment. An equity assessment is really useful for providing a baseline understanding of equity for the public and in the services that you are providing to the public. It also allows some self-reflection on identifying inequitable policies, procedures, practices, and outcomes. Looking internally at your organization, it happens very often that there are inequitable policies and procedures that are in place, and ones that don't take into consideration accessibility needs, for example. And then uncovering programs and services that exclude certain groups or inadvertently create inequity. Thinking about when you're listening to the community, what are the needs, or if you aren't addressing them, are there new programs that you can implement that will address these needs? Then another benefit is developing meaningful action plans for addressing identified equity issues. It's like I said, it's a great place for self-reflection, but also for planning forward. And it's an iterative process. It's cyclical. It's something that you should be continually analyzing as you do update policies and procedures, as you are collecting data to look and see what the trends are. And then another element of this is looking at what data do you need and what do you have. I did see on the word cloud, I think budget was the biggest one there. And undertaking an equity assessment, comprehensive one, it can be costly, but that doesn't mean that you can't implement elements of an equity assessment and get a lot of meaningful benefits and results that you can use to inform your programming. So looking at your program right now, do you already have clear equity goals and maybe you haven't realized that? For example, are you assessing subpopulations that may have disparate impacts? Do you have data relating to those subpopulations? You may be collecting data about where these are occurring. What are the impacts? Is your program evaluation more outward or inwardly focused? This is food for thought as you're looking at immediate things that you can do to improve equity in your community and in your programming. What I want to add is data tracked internally or proactively gathered externally. That can be a big element as well. And I see we have about 5 minutes left, so kind of going through these a little bit more accelerated because I want to make sure we have time for some questions that have popped up in the chat. So some considerations of equity assessments include access and inclusion, power dynamics, transparency and accountability, and long-term sustainability. We mentioned accessibility and inclusion in the example with UC Berkeley and gathering data of those different areas and how accessibility needs weren't taken into consideration at the implementation of the program. So thinking about that in your equity assessment and identifying barriers to participation and work towards creating a more inclusive environment and a productive program that is efficient and can include all. And then looking at power dynamics, when you are surveying the community, having that awareness that if you're a large organization in your community or you're the state and local government, there is somewhat inherently a power dynamic at play where that may impact the decision making or the feedback that you are receiving. So trying to make sure that you are creating a space where people feel very safe to share their feedback about the needs of the community and establishing that base layer of trust. And that trust continues through transparency and accountability, keeping the community updated on, what your initial plans are. What are you doing, quarterly? What are you doing annually? I think Starbucks is a great example of that. Since their initial incident that triggered their first equity assessment in 2018, they have provided updates on their website at least quarterly about different initiatives and some of the results of those initiatives to have that transparency with the public. And then the last one would be long-term sustainability. When you are implementing measures, think about, can you sustain this? Do you have the staff to continue to provide equitable services? Is this going to reduce disparities over time, or is it just going to have an immediate impact and then potentially could spike again? And that also highlights how this is a cyclical process and you will need to be looking at results and considering, I would say, at least on an annual basis. Pass it over for the last CPE question.
Thank you, Megan. What equity assessment consideration that was discussed do you think presents the most challenges for your organization or community? Either A, access and inclusion, B, power dynamics, C, transparency and accountability, or D, long-term sustainability. So we'll give you about 15 to 20 seconds to answer this polling question. If you select your answer and hit the submit button, your polling question will be recorded. Getting up there. Give you about 5 more seconds to answer this one. All right, let's check out the results.
All right, I think we're going to skip this last mentee just so that way we have some time for a couple of questions. Thank you all for attending today. We really enjoyed talking to you all about this topic and would love to open it up to any questions. You can use the Q&A box to type those in, and we'll try and answer as many as possible. Otherwise, our contact details are on the screen if you'd like to reach out to us directly with any of your questions. I see a couple out there around the Executive Order 13985. Yes, that does cover the requirement for federal agencies to implement an equity assessment. That's the executive order that came out in January 2021. It's titled Advancing Racial Equity and Support for Underserved Communities in the Federal Government. And that is at
That can be looked up on the Federal Register as well.
Yeah. And then I see another question around, is there a benchmark publication that we can use? And I believe that's related to benchmarking for equity assessments. I would say that there is not a one-stop shop where you can view all equity assessments outside of the federal agencies ones, but there are quite a few that are publicly available. So I would encourage you to do a little Googling research on what your focus area is for your organization, and look up some equity assessments of potentially some larger organizations that may have already completed an equity assessment, may have had additional funding to complete that. So that is a great place to start and look at what they're doing. All right. And then, is there a tool that you can use for an equity assessment? I would say that there is not a one-size-fits-all tool for an equity assessment. It's something that can be customized to the needs of your organization based on the number of individuals that are in your community that you are serving, the size of your organization as well, your ability to collect data. So that's really something that can be customized. Happy to chat about that further if you'd like to reach out directly and see if we can connect on any resources. Michael, do you have anything you want to add before I pass it back over to Chad?
No, just thank you everybody for joining, and like Megan mentioned, please reach out to us if you have any questions or want to learn more.
Awesome. Thank you, Megan and Michael, for a great presentation today. If we didn't have time to answer your questions, we will do our best to follow up with you after the webcast. As a reminder, if you attended today's presentation in a group and would like to receive CPE credit, you must complete the group attendance sheet found in the slide deck and handouts window. If you participated as an individual and met all certification requirements, your certification is available for download now in the CPE progress window. I'll keep the webcast console open for a few minutes to give you time to download your CPE certificate. A copy of your CPE certificate will be emailed within 3 weeks should you have any difficulty downloading it now. And here's a link to an online survey where you can provide feedback for today's presentation. Please take a moment to complete the survey as your feedback is very important to us. Thank you for joining us today, and we hope you join us again next time.